Welcome. This is lecture number 9 of Software Requirements Engineering. We talked about social and cultural issues in the last lecture. Now we will start talking about requirements elicitation activities. This is where you can say that the fine-grained processes start within the requirements engineering process. Just to recap what the requirements engineering process is, and to remind all of you the coarse-grained activities in that process, we have requirements elicitation, followed by requirements analysis and negotiation, followed by requirements specification, and followed by requirements validation. You can see on the screen the requirements document is produced along with the agreed requirements. Now you see a thick arrow pointing towards requirements elicitation. This points to the fact that we will be talking about this activity in lot more detail in the next 3 lectures, including this one, and then we will take up other activities. As you can see from the screen, that user needs, domain information, existing system information, regulations and standards are being fed into the requirements elicitation activities. Now we will take up detailed discussion on requirements elicitation now. Elicit means to gather, to acquire, extract and obtain. So the requirements elicitation means gathering requirements, or some people call it discovering requirements. Both these terms are commonly used in the requirements engineering processes and in the requirements engineering texts and published literature. It consists of lots of activities. In today's lecture, we will talk about the basics of requirements elicitation. And then we will take each one of these activities and discuss them in more detail. So you can say that requirements elicitation includes activities involved in discovering requirements for the system. Or you can say that requirements elicitation is a process in which requirements are gathered for the new system to be developed. Again, I have used the word process here. When you see the word or read the word process, this means that it is an ongoing activity. That the term process includes this meaning in it, that this is a continuous, and I would say an iterative activity. It is not sort of a sequential activity. So you do some elicitation and then you think over it and you do some more elicitation, and if you're not clear about something, you go back and get more information about it. That is all these things are included in requirements elicitation. Now, what are the basics of elicitation? As you can see on the screen, there are 4 basic things or basics of knowledge acquisition, which is the same thing as knowledge discovery or knowledge gathering. What are these basic things? Number 1, reading. Number 2, listening. Number 3, asking. And number 4, observing. So these are the 4 fundamental ways in which knowledge can be acquired or information can be gathered. Now, if you look at children, they don't necessarily acquire knowledge in the same order because they cannot read. They observe more than they can read, or they listen. But since we are talking about document or gathering requirements, we have listed reading as the first thing or the first activity of knowledge acquisition. Second is listening. Third is based on reading and listening is asking, and observing is also a very important source or ways of knowledge acquisition. The techniques for requirements elicitation are again of 4 types, and these are more than just techniques. These are categories of techniques. There are individual techniques, there are group techniques, then there are modeling techniques, and lastly there are cognitive techniques. We use any one of them or all of them or some of them in combination depending on the type of project to elicit requirements or to gather requirements for a software product. Today we are only talking about major foundations or discussion points that we will elaborate more in the following 2 lectures. So let's talk about some of the problems that occur during requirements elicitation process. As you can see on the screen, there are 3 problems listed. Number 1, the problems of scope. Number 2, problems of understanding. And number 3, problems of volatility. Let's elaborate a little bit on each one of them. Problems of scope refer to the fact that the boundary of the system is ill-defined. That is, when customers are customers want a product to be developed, they are not sure as to what should be included in the product and what should be left out of the software product. And so they themselves are not clear about the boundary of the new system. Now, if this boundary is not clear, the requirements engineers will have difficulty in asking the right questions. They would have difficulty or will probably or certainly be misguided in reading the appropriate documents or observing the right processes. So one of the main problems in the requirements elicitation process is problems of scope. The second thing that is included in this is the urge by some clients to provide design information to the requirements engineers. Remember, in the beginning of the semester, we talked about the fact that requirements model should consist of what the system does as compared to how it solves a particular problem. And if the client has some technical staff, then they can provide unnecessary design information which can then restrict the scope of the solution and also restrict the scope of the problem. Refresh your minds about the fact that some design information needs to be conveyed to the requirements engineers, and that is because of interoperability requirements of the new system with the existing software products of the client. But providing unnecessary design information will certainly have negative impact on defining the scope and the boundaries of the new software system. The second point that you see listed on your screens are the problems of understanding. Users have typically incomplete understanding of their needs. In addition to that, poor understanding of computers' capabilities and limitations. Now, every computer professional can relate a story of poor understanding of computer capabilities and limitations of their clients. And most of the students, I guess, are also familiar with this, that people in general, laymen I would say, are not fully aware of capabilities of the computer and also its limitations. So this sometimes become a problem in the elicitation process of the requirements of the new software system. Another problem that would fall under this category is the fact that analysts have poor knowledge of the problem domain. And one cannot highlight enough on the fact that both the requirements engineers as well as the developers, which include designers as well as programmers, should acquire some knowledge about the problem domain or application domain in which they are working. Without that, they would run into very funny situations where they are assuming things about that application domain, and once they start assuming things, they can immediately start making incorrect decisions. Another problem of understanding is the fact that users and analysts speak different languages. We had talked about this particular concept in our lecture on social and cultural issues in the requirements engineering process. But looking at, even if the customers are of the same country or in the same city or in the same town, they can use different languages. And that is not their natural languages. I mean, customers are speaking in natural languages, and members of the technical staff and the developer organization are speaking computer lingo or computer terminology, and they can sometimes miscommunicate, and as a result, the information that they have gathered, it may not be correct. Certain phrases in the English language, for example, have specialized meaning in the computer industry or in the software industry. So using those terminologies can have incorrect information as far as this elicitation process is concerned. For example, consider the word pattern. The word pattern is used by software engineers to convey a very specific area of specialization in design and architectures, and also in requirements. But this is also a word which is used by all English-speaking people or people who use English to communicate. So, a designer or a requirements engineer may take the word pattern out of context and in the context of software engineering terminology. Another problem of understanding is the ease of omitting obvious information. And we had touched upon this also, that the domain experts find it very easy to assume basic things about their domains, and they do not convey this to the requirements engineering staff or requirements engineers. So this is also known as the problems of implicit information or tacit information, in which the domain experts think that this is such an obvious information that it is common knowledge and should not be conveyed explicitly. Then another problem that occurs in problems of understanding is conflicting views of different users and stakeholders. And we have talked about this particular issue on a number of times up to this point in the semester. Another problem that occurs is that requirements are often stated vaguely and they are untestable. Let's, for example, consider the two terms user-friendly and robust. Now, user-friendliness is something which is very vague. Some product can be very user-friendly for one person, and it may be terribly difficult to use for another person. And if you remember, we had talked about this in the non-functional requirements in quite a bit of detail, and there's no need to go into any detail at this point. And so is the case with robustness. How do you define robustness so that everyone understands it? And it has to be done with respect to the qualitative and quantitative ways that we had talked about in the non-functional requirements. A third category of problems that you see listed on the screen are the problems of volatility. Requirements evolve over time, and since requirements reflect the business needs of the customers, they are continuously changing. No business, no industry, no profession is in static mode for a long period of time. Even if a business is doing very well, it's mature, the companies which are running those businesses are continuously trying to improve and enhance their businesses. As a result, the requirements are changing, the requirements are evolving, and this is not a bad thing. Although volatility has negative side effects also, and we talked about the fact that if the rate of change of requirements is very high, the probability of a project becoming a failure is also very high. But in many cases, one would realize that the requirements are changing for a good reason, and requirements and such requirements must be accommodated. But remember, we talked about the importance of management of changes, and so this also applies here. And the evolution of requirements have to be managed properly from the very beginning of the requirements elicitation process. Let's now talk about context in requirements elicitation process. Fundamentally, there are four things that are the context for requirements elicitation process. They are organization, number two, environment, number three, the project, and number four, the constraints imposed by people. So let's talk about each one of them in some detail. Organizations are submitters of information. They are also consumers of outputs. So organizations submit information and they also use information. Or I can say it another way, that organizations are producers of data and they are consumers of information, and they are the primary beneficiary or primary target in which the new system is going to change the business process. It is the business process of the organization which is going to be changed by the new software product. So organization, although themselves are not software product, but are very important in the context of the requirements elicitation process. The environment consists of software and hardware which is existing already in that organization. Environment also includes the maturity of the target system domain. That is the application area that we have chosen for the automation. This can be healthcare industry, this can be military software, this can be financial software, this can be sales and inventory software, this can be computer-based training software. So if the domains are mature, the management of the evolution of requirements is easy. The domain information is available readily to the requirements engineers. There are books written on such topics, there are papers written already. So if the domain is mature, the rate of change of requirements also goes down, and as a result our elicitation process will be very stable. Another important part in the environment is the maturity and the certainty of the target system's interfaces to the larger system. Remember, we have talked about the interoperability in quite some detail. Interoperability of different products is a fact of life. We have to deal with it. No products work in vacuum, and so when the interfaces of different products are defined, they can work with each other and in unison to achieve the business goals of the client organization. And also another thing which is part of the environment as far as the context and requirements elicitation process is concerned is the role of the target system in the larger canvas of applications. And the new application is very important. Some minor changes may have to be made to existing applications. If the new system is not very important, or relatively speaking, then all the accommodation or changes have to be made in this new system. So, these things have to be understood well by the requirements engineers when they are in the elicitation process. Let's consider the third aspect of the context, that is the project. The attributes of different stakeholder communities, such as the end users, sponsors, developers, and requirements analysts, are also of very important part in the requirements elicitation process. And these attributes are management style, management hierarchy, and domain experience. If we have a good management style, again, this is a very superficial word, good. How do you define good? But I would say if the management style makes it comfortable for stakeholders to communicate with each other, then the success of the project would be fairly easy to achieve. But if the management style is such that people cannot communicate freely and express their opinions freely, then obviously the project is going to be in difficulty. Another thing is the management hierarchy. how the top management is involved and how much the top management is involved, and do lower level or mid-level managers have authority to make decisions which will then be validated by the top management, and how experienced the developers are, how experienced the requirements engineers are in the domain. This thing will come up again and again. Requirements engineers must learn their application domain, otherwise they will be doing a disservice to their clients. They must acquire and understand fully the fundamentals of the business domain that they are working in. The last of the context are the constraints imposed by people involved in the elicitation process. There are material concerns regarding the costs, regarding the time, that is the schedule of the project, and the desired quality of the software system. Now these constraints play or interact with each other to come up with a complex set of constraints which can limit the proper execution of the elicitation process. For example, if the point man in the client organization only grants one meeting to the requirements engineering team, then one can safely assume that the requirements engineers will either make their own requirements, that is, they start assuming things about the project, or they will start gathering information from different stakeholders, but who have no authority to provide such information. So the amount of time and resources and due consideration given to the requirements team in providing the information during the requirements elicitation process has a direct impact on the success or failure of the software product. Let's continue our discussion on this topic and look at some of the guidelines as far as requirements elicitations are concerned. Number one, assess the business and technical feasibility for the proposed system. These guidelines are for the requirements engineers, for you who are learning about requirements engineering. So you need to assess the business and technical feasibility for the proposed system. Number two, identify the people who will help specify requirements and understand their organizational bias. That is, you have to find people who can help you in the organization whose project you are working on. It may be very strange for you to note that not all people in the client organization will provide you the correct information. Remember, we talked about denial of information as a social issue. And third point is you have to define the technical environment. The technical environment that exists within the client organization. And you have to understand the level of technical maturity of the people involved in the project that you're working on, and determine their mental capabilities, their capabilities to provide information, their capabilities to hide information, their understanding of computer capabilities, their understanding of computer limitations, and so forth. So before you start gathering requirements, you have to develop a baseline for yourself of that organization so that your requirements elicitation process will run as smooth as possible. Every organization has some people who are naysayers in that organization, who do not want any positive change, who do not want any advancement in how they work. They like status quo, and they defend status quo to their death. and you have to not only know them, but somehow get their feedback also, because in some of their points they will highlight some other things which will be very useful for you during the requirements elicitation process. You also have to identify domain constraints that limit the functionality or performance of the existing system. This can only happen if you know the domain to a certain degree. Now, domain constraints are important because they also help you in scoping the problem, in defining the boundaries of the proposed software system. The fifth thing that you should keep in mind is that you have to define one or more requirements elicitation methods. Remember, we talked about basics of knowledge acquisition. We talked about techniques. So we have to define, you have to define as a requirements engineer, which techniques you will apply. You have to define, are you going to use individual techniques, or you are going to use group techniques? Are you going to use modeling techniques, or you are going to use cognitive techniques, or a combination of them? For example, do you want to have interviews? Do you want to have focus groups on a particular subject? You want to have team meetings? And then you need to synthesize this information. You need to develop a proper structure of conducting the requirements elicitation process. You also need to solicit participation from many people, not just one or two or three, but from many people, so that requirements are defined from different points of view. Be sure to identify the rationale, that is the reasons for each requirement that is recorded. So not only you need to get information from many people, but when they provide certain information, you need to document the reason, and if they do not give a reason, you have to ask for the reason. Let's say a customer says, I want a response time of 2 milliseconds for this particular input. You need to ask why 2 milliseconds? Why not 5 milliseconds, for example? And if you find that the response that is given by the customer, then you need to document that along with the requirements. You need to identify ambiguous requirements as candidates for prototyping. All of you know what prototyping is, and we will talk about prototyping as it applies to requirements engineering process in a lecture. But whenever you have ambiguous requirements, whenever you have conflicting requirements also, you can say that this is a candidate for prototyping. But certainly for ambiguous requirements, so that you can clearly understand the winner when the prototype is developed, you can document requirement as clearly and consistently as possible. You also need to create usage scenarios to help customers and users better identify requirements. User scenarios is a technique in which you document how a particular functionality is achieved, or how the functionality is achieved from the user's perspective, or you can say it in other words, is how things happen from user's perspective. These are not the how software is implemented, but how certain things are used. That's why they are known as usage scenarios. And in that way, your customers will be able to identify the requirements properly. And this is a very good way of communicating and helping your customers so that they can provide you the correct information which is necessary for development of the software product. Remember, we talked about observation as one of the ways in acquiring knowledge. Now, there is a very important area of research known as ethnomethodology that looks for behaviors that may be different in specific cultures but may have the same underlying purpose or meaning. Ethnomethodology has to deal with observations. For example, let's take boasting. Now, boasting is common in all societies, all cultures, but it is expressed or it is done in different ways. Americans boast in a different way from French. We Pakistanis boast in an entirely different way. And so goes on with every other country and every other culture, every other society. So the underlying purpose is boasting, but how they do it is different, and it varies from society to society. Now, this ethnomethodology is a very useful methodology in requirements elicitation. Also, under this ethnomethodology, there is this concept of conversational analysis. And conversational analysis means that once conversation has happened, experts sit down and see what were the non-verbal messages that were being sent during that discussion. Whenever people are talking, they use their verbal skills, but they also use their non-verbal skills and non-verbal gestures to communicate certain information. For example, if two people are talking on phone and one just say, and continues to do that, the other person on the phone may get a feeling that the other party is not paying attention. And one can say that, are you listening to me? And if the person is really listening, then they can, yes, I'm listening, and you told me this or that. But this conversational analysis also has a place in some very important projects. This can be used in the requirements elicitation process. Similarly, detailed video analyses can also be conducted. And this approach, which is the detailed video analysis, has been in use in the sports industry for quite some time. The sports experts look at videos and determine how a particular player plays in certain situations or circumstances. In software engineering, detailed video analysis of different conversations or brainstorming sessions can also be very, very useful, because they can provide the behavior of the group in non-verbal situations also. And they can also capture the tenseness, I would say, of the situation, the atmosphere of the meeting, which can be, if the meeting is tense, that can be captured in a video and can be analyzed. And it can also capture the emotional aspects of different participants in the requirements elicitation process. For example, if a user is presenting information in a very emotional way, then one can analyze and understand the fact that this is very important to that particular user group or to that particular individual. Now, if all of these things are just documented using a pen and paper, that concept of emotion and rationale is not documented along with the requirements. So ethnomethodology is a very important part of the requirements elicitation process in certain projects. Obviously, this is expensive. Obviously, one cannot have ethnomethodology applied to all projects across the board, but certain projects which require this kind of detailed analysis will benefit quite a bit if ethnomethodology is used. We also talked about the role of cognitive sciences in requirements elicitation process. Errors in statements can happen in two places. Number one, the perception of facts. The perception of facts is a reality, and the linguistic representation of one of these perceptions is a personal reality. So one can make in either perception of facts, which is understanding the reality incorrectly, or one can make an error in personal reality, that is linguistically specifying that reality incorrectly. Number one, you can either understand it incorrectly. Number two, you can say it incorrectly. So to remove these errors, requirements should be reviewed during and after elicitation process. So psychology has become an important part of requirements elicitation process, and there is a lot of research being conducted in this area, so that in conjunction with computer science, how psychology can affect the process of requirements elicitation, so that the requirements are gathered in such a way that our requirements model is consistent and is complete as much as possible. We talked about modeling having importance in the requirements elicitation process. We can say that modeling scenarios has been a very useful way for documenting requirements. We use case modeling, or we can say scenario modeling, for these things. Use case modeling involves defining actors or users of the system and how the actors interact with the system that we are developing. Remember, we talked about creation of usage scenarios. Use case modeling also helps us in understanding and documenting functional requirements of the system. So you can say that use case descriptions are functional or behavioral views of the proposed software system. And we will talk about use case modeling in detail in later lectures in the semester. In order for us to continue with our discussion on the requirements elicitation process that is followed by this lecture, let's recap some of the things we have talked about today. We have talked about the concept of elicitation, and we have introduced the requirements elicitation process. We noted that there are four basic elements of knowledge acquisition. They are reading, listening, asking, and observing. All four of them have to be applied in the requirements elicitation process. Domain information and different documents that are produced by the client must be carefully read and understood. Whenever interviews are conducted, the requirements engineers must listen to them very, very carefully and understand them along the way. And if something is not clear, questions must be asked. These can be either verbal or written. And observation of how processes are conducted in the client organization is also a very important source of information. We also talked about knowledge acquisition techniques, which consist of individual, group, modeling, and cognitive. And we talked about elicitation process, We talked about context, and I mentioned few guidelines for requirements elicitation. From the next lecture, we will look at different aspects of elicitation, and we will continue our discussion on how requirements can be elicited. Till then, thank you very much, and Khuda Hafiz.